Dragons have long been a fascination of mine. Indeed, as just mentioned, my doctoral thesis concerned dragons in the early modern period, and I've returned again and again to these monsters in my subsequent research. This fascination is in part coming from a long-standing love of the work of Tolkien, whose dragons are amongst the most memorable in fiction. In this paper, I plan to propose a kind of family tree for Smaug, the greatest and chiefest of Tolkien's drakes. And while scholars have previously discussed several inspirations behind Smaug, namely Fafnir and Beowulf's Bane, I'm going to situate Tolkien's dragons within the wider history of these monsters and consider how Smaug might relate to his distant relatives, some of whom were described by Pliny the Elder, others drawn into religious disputes, and a few who were cast from the annals of natural history by early taxonomists. In this paper, I'll begin by discussing some of the many possible origins of dragons in prehistoric times, before considering a rough outline of the family tree, and then following the history of dragons from the medieval period to today. So we're going to be covering about 10,000 years of history. I hope we can all get through it. So I'd like to start to reflect on this quote from Tolkien regarding dragons from The Monster and the Critics. So a dragon is no idle fancy. Whatever may be his origins, in fact or invention, the dragon in legend is a potent creation of men's imagination, richer in significance than his barrow is in gold. Even today, despite the critics, you may find men not ignorant of tragic legend and history, who have heard of heroes and indeed seen them, who yet have been caught by the fascination of the worm. So dragons are special creatures. They're possessed of a wealth of concepts that render them equal parts significant and fascinating. This is true not only for us today, but also the people of the past. And many a scholar has attempted to explain the human tendency to return to dragons in one form or another over the course of thousands of years. First, though, it's worth addressing the question of what even is a dragon, which is worth an entire paper in and of itself, though I've only got time to address some parts of that question here. Despite not existing, fierce debate has raged over the past century as to the exact form of this monster, its origins, and its meanings. Impossibly complicated by the infinite nuances of 1,000 years of global history, to adequately define this serpentine beast in their universal entirety is perhaps an impossible task, though we can certainly place some parameters upon what physical and narrative shapes dragons took within the temporal and spatial bounds of my paper today. So, beginning with terminology, serpents, dragons, these are words that were often used quite interchangeably in pre-modern Europe, with precise terminology being used inconsistently, overlappingly, and varying in terms of geography, language, and time. Even though the beast in question is unequivocally of the same monstrous breed, what we might now term a dragon would simply be another kind of snake to the people of the past. And any particular beast may be interchangeably called a serpent, a wyvern, a worm, lindworm, or all of the above at once. So when studying how pre-modern Europeans interacted with representations of dragons, it's important to remember that these creatures were a part of their reality, existing on equal terms with the animals that more immediately surrounded them. Indeed, dragons and similar fantastical beasts were often stated in bestiaries as simply a sub or related species of snake. Dragons were believed to be real, and the possibility of meeting one was not out of the question. For many Europeans, dragons were a distant phenomenon, whether spatially or temporally, but real nonetheless. While contemporaries may have believed in dragons, this did not make their appearance or abilities consistent, and a range of interpretations of the monster existed. Physically, dragons are serpentine in general terms, but possessed extraordinary form or ability which sets them apart from normal snakes. Common extraordinary traits include, but are not limited to, great size, fiery breath, flight, whether by wings or other supernatural means, poisoned blood, many limbs, speech, shape-shifting, feathers or fur, chimeric qualities such as multiple heads, different animals. There's a wide range of different physical descriptors for dragons that build off of that base serpentine form. And there are also many other creatures that are associated with serpents and dragons that share many of their physical characteristics, like the rooster-headed cockatrice, the crowned basilisk, or the alpine tatzelvern. They're also considered, where appropriate, though it's worth noting that these beasts, while monstrous serpents, do not typically occupy the same narrative territory as most dragons, despite often sharing the page with them in early modern works of taxonomy. Indeed, narratively, dragons usually function in quite specific ways, and while other kinds of monsters can fulfill the same niche, creatures of serpentine form are by far the most recurrent, whether the stories they appear in use the specific term of dragon or not. In European folklore and mythology, dragons typically appear in oppositional narratives as creatures to be slain by a heroic figure who is rewarded for their deeds. Dragons, much like demons, are multifarious in their appearance, but share common narrative trends and general features with no strict taxonomical definition, more a broad category of beings than a particular species. Whereas other mythological creatures might lose their identity if their physical characteristics change. For example, a unicorn, centaur, or mermaid are very explicit in their appearance, becoming something else entirely should they change. Meanwhile, a dragon may wear any number of physical features while still occupying the same role as an embodiment of a fearful and terrible power in opposition to moral ideas. No matter their size or shape, dragons are known to audiences as something terrifying and, in a way, something important. Those who study history, anthropology, literature, and other disciplines have attempted to explain the definitive origin and taxonomy of dragons with varying levels of success. Literary scholars in the past 100 years have taken different approaches, which can generally be seen as either exclusive or inclusive. The former offers a very strict approach to the taxonomy, creating categories of true dragons and those which are seen as pretenders or half-formed imitators. Tolkien, who pioneered the study of monsters in literature in his scholarly work concerning Beowulf, called the dragon of Beowulf alongside Fafnir the only two Northern European dragons, though modern academics like Martin Arnold have criticized this as being too narrow and prefer to include any beast of general draconic stylings in their work. Scientists, archaeologists, and anthropologists, meanwhile, have attempted with varying levels of success to define dragons by their supposed origins in collective human thought. Some early scholarship posited that all draconic creatures found in mythologies across the globe were descended from a single dragon myth, originating somewhere in the Middle East, which was then diffused across the planet by the movement of people out of the first cradle of civilization. Grafton Elliott Smith, a proponent of what was later termed hyperdiffusionism, a theory that certain prehistoric ideas and technologies all originated from a single civilization, which has since been dismissed as pseudo-archaeology, suggested in 1919 that dragons first emerged in ancient Egypt before being exported alongside other facets of Egyptian civilization to the rest of the world. The diffusion theory is not widely accepted today, especially given that Smith's Egyptocentric model of the development of global civilization wholly fails to stand up to modern scrutiny, and the differences between the Northern European fire drake and the imperial Chinese lung ultimately suggesting other factors at play. So many attempts to create a universal theory for the occurrence of monstrous serpents across the globe usually fall apart because of a specifically Western construction of the category. For while the Chinese creature we often call a dragon may have some superficial resemblance to the drake of Europe with their serpentine shape and ability to fly, they have independent origins and distinct cultural symbolic nuances, which make them difficult to comprehensively unite under a single ideological framework. Indeed, there is a question as to if we should call non-European dragons dragons at all, and should perhaps consider them as culturally distinct creatures that the English language has previously chosen to call dragons out of ease rather than accuracy. Indeed, the Wikipedia page for dragons covers serpentine monsters of all varieties across the whole globe, though how useful this is when considering unique cultural circumstances is questionable. Dragons being a manifestation of some primeval phenomenon that collectively scarred the imagination of humanity is a notion that has been long considered. Indeed, the fear our ancestors had of actual creatures that have been made monstrous by the passage of time may be one origin of the dragon that is posited most famously by the cosmologist Carl Sagan, who speculated that dragons are reflections of early mammalian experiences of dinosaurs that have been passed down to us through genetic memory, ones made even more real by the existence of dinosaur bones discovered by our more recent ancestors. Even Tolkien drew parallels between dragons and dinosaurs in a 1938 lecture. And indeed, there is a certain flavour of the prehistoric to the winged steeds of the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings, that in some adaptations take on a decidedly pterodactyl-like appearance. The most notable of these approaches is Adrienne Mayer's 2000 work, The First Fossil Hunters, where it is argued that the fossils of certain prehistoric creatures were the inspiration for monsters like the Cyclops, giants, and griffins in the Mediterranean world. While some of those theories, like pygmy elephant skulls being the origin of the Cyclops due to the large cavity in their forehead, are debated by anthropologists, the methodology has been applied with varying levels of success by paleontologists to other mythical creatures. Assertions by people like Sagan that dinosaur skeletons provide a universal basis for the collective imagining of dragons are often considered less plausible, however, due to the difficulty in accessing and identifying relatively complete dinosaur skeletons, even in modern times. The likelihood of our ancestors being able to gain access to fossils and find sufficiently intact ones at that in several continents from which to create shared, similar draconic imagery is rather low, though not entirely impossible. After all, a 4th century Chinese historian is credited with the first written description of dinosaur bones, in which he believed those to be of dragons. While difficult to prove, the idea continues to provide scholars with material for debate. Instead of looking to the ground for fossils of long-dead dinosaurs, Robert Blust instead looks to the skies in a 2000 article and suggests that dragons are the result of our ancestors grappling with the causality of natural events as they observed weather phenomena, namely rainbows. Blust builds upon earlier 20th century scholarship, rejecting the diffusional model put forth by the likes of Smith and seeking a more concrete answer to the seemingly global parallel development of the dragon. He argues that dragons are a result of pre-scientific speculation about weather events, linking dragons with rainbows due to their shared affiliation with ideas like water and treasure, and offering a range of examples of dragon characteristics drawn from mythologies around the world that align with his rainbow hypothesis. Blust opposes the biological model of dragon origins offered by Sagan, believing his own rainbow model to be the most rational. However, since his paper, there has been no mass universal adoption of his rainbow theory amongst dragon scholars of any discipline, with many authors preferring to consider the dragon as some kind of psychological construct shared by humans across the globe. I did, however, in the course of my doctoral research, find a few dragons that were rainbow-hued, such as these dragons from the Augsburg Book of Miracles. And as I was preparing this paper, it also occurred to me that Smaug himself could perhaps take on a bit of a rainbow hue himself. His underbelly being encrusted with gold and gems from many long years spent laying on his hoard might add some sparkle of many colours from various coloured gemstones. Furthering this notion of dragons being an embedded part of humanity's collective unconsciousness, formed by our ancestors' memories, anthropologist David E. Jones developed in 2002 his raptor-snake-cat primate-predator complex theory, which posits that dragons are the hybrid psychological realization of humanity's earliest predators. While a tantalizing theory offering an evolutionary origin of the dragon, Jones's work has been disputed by more recent scholars, in particular pointing out that Jones's thesis does not take into account that not all dragons have a cat's hot breath, which he claims is the origin of fire, nor do all dragons fly as the raptor. He does accept that the serpentine aspect, however, is formative in nearly all creatures we might call dragons. And there is one version of Smaug who strangely fits into this hybrid thesis quite well, being the 1977 animated version, who has been given cat-like features and quite an amount of fur, which is somewhat rare amongst pre-modern depictions of dragons, but not completely unheard of. The European dragon, which most inspired Tolkien, does have some definite rootings, however, amongst the serpentine monsters that are found amongst Proto-Indo-European cultures. Indeed, nearly all Indo-European cultures have a dragon-slaying myth, whether it be Heracles and the Lenaean Hydra, the Hittite story of Tarhunt and Ilyanka, or Thor and Jormungandr, which likely originated within the Proto-Indo-European culture and represents the primordial struggle between order and chaos. These creatures are apocalyptic-level threats that take deific strength to defeat, often being fiercely intelligent, cunning, or simply vast in strength and scale. These stories would go on to inspire others over the centuries, from St. George through to popular fantasy tales of today, creating a diametric relationship between dragon slayer and dragon. And while the pagan origins of some of the folklore concerning dragons does not necessarily conform to the later Christian moral standards of a dichotomy between good and evil, the dragon still represents a host of negative connotations such as chaos, avarice, and death, which sees it become a powerful force of sin when these stories are Christianized in the Middle Ages. While some dragons were possessed of powerful mythological origins, many others were simply a type of animal that wandered the globe. The line often blurs between animalistic dragons and their supernatural god-battling mythological counterparts, but it is worth noting that throughout the pre-modern world there was a deep belief in the reality of dragons. Indeed, one of the earliest accounts of dragons in the annals of natural history can be found in the 8th book of Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia, where he describes the natural enmity between these monsters and elephants. Africa produces elephants, but it is in India that produces the largest, as well as the dragon, which is perpetually at war with the elephant and is itself so enormous in size that it is easily to envelop the elephants with its folds and encircle them in its coils. The contest is equally fatal to both. The elephant vanquished falls to the earth and by its weight crushes the dragon, which is entwined around it. For over 1,000 years after he wrote these words, Pliny's description of this conflict between titans would help to inform natural philosophers and artists alike as to the behavior of these beasts in the wild, with just a selection of medieval images there depicting this conflict. So dragons were believed to be an intrinsic part of the natural order, their existence confirmed by the seemingly inviolable sources of countless instances of eyewitness testimony and the passages of scripture. In Europe, for hundreds of years, the dragon was a fact of life, a fact which saw a significant continuity of belief in this period, despite emerging skepticism by the 17th century, as we shall discuss later. So we turn now briefly to the sort of rough family tree that I have constructed for Smaug, charting his ancestors, cousins, and inspirations. At the top, I've used a picture of Tiamat to represent the host of Indo-European mythologies we discussed a short while ago. And then descending from these myths, on the left, we see the animalistic dragons described by Pliny. We also see the great red dragon of the Christian Middle Ages, which we'll discuss shortly. In the center, we see the Norse and Germanic legends of Fafnir. And to the right, we see Beowulf's Bane, which comes from related mythological traditions. We see Tolkien's Smaug being principally inspired by Fafnir and Beowulf's Bane, with some distant influence from the biblical dragon. And on the left, we see some of Smaug's cousins, the topic of much of my research, where the history of the dragon becomes entangled with religion and natural science in the early modern period. We'll return to this family tree in a bit and even consider how other dragons might fit into this schema. So Tolkien's dragons require very little introduction. Indeed, they're perhaps the archetype for how we consider dragons today. These are creatures of evil, monstrous destructive forces that are guided by greed and a sly intelligence. While generally being of serpentine form, the physicality of Tolkien's dragons is somewhat varied, with Glaurung lacking wings, unlike Calagon and Smaug, but they still tend to breathe fire and covet riches while bringing evil wherever they go. Interestingly, in his correspondences, Tolkien states that his very first story written as a child included a great green dragon, and mentions to W.H. Auden that he was obsessed with the philological puzzle of having to say great green dragon rather than green great dragon. His letter demonstrates an early fascination with dragons that, while temporarily shelved by love of language, would be returned to later in life. Interestingly, the notable named dragons of Middle-earth are given colours such as reds, golds, and black. Tolkien having abandoned his early green dragons outside of the Shire's famous inn, which is notably less threatening than his other drakes, more at home amongst the pastoral idyll of the Shire than the fiery, apocalyptic monsters we see elsewhere in the legendarium. The medieval influence is certainly clear. In the Middle Ages, there are at least two traditions with very strong draconic narratives that were popular across Europe. In the first instance is the Christian tradition. Serpents, dragons, and dragon-like creatures appear multiple times in the Bible, with notable appearances in the Old Testament, books of Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Numbers, and Kings, and in the New Testament Gospels, Psalms, and the book of Revelation. They are commonly depicted as creatures of evil and chaos, the most prominent in the Bible being Satan, in the form of the cunningly intelligent serpent of Eden, and the world-shatteringly destructive great red dragon of the apocalypse. Though a few, such as the snakes created from Moses and Aaron's staffs, are largely free from such connotations. Beside the crucifixion, the fall is one of the most represented biblical stories in Christian art, and indeed for medieval audiences, the serpent of Eden was perhaps the most visible snake in their everyday lives, as it adorned church paintings and stained glass windows, and prefigures prominently in the creation myth of the Abrahamic faiths. While less common, the great red dragon of the apocalypse was also regularly depicted in church artwork. In the Christian tradition, Satan has the dubious honor of bookending the Bible, being present at both the early days of the earth and its last. Theologically, these serpentine monsters were present at some of the most important moments of Christianity as figures of evil. And they recur in various stories of saints, either as Satan himself or as his proxy, with the tales of St. George, St. Michael the Archangel, and St. Margaret of Antioch being amongst the most popular. The other medieval strand inspiring Tolkien was that of Nordic legend, especially Fafnir, the principal draconic antagonist of the story of Siegfried, and Beowulf's Bane, the dragon who kills the titular protagonist of that poem. These are monsters associated with treasure hoards and epic narratives, gods, monsters, human greed, and human folly. They are both challenges for heroes to overcome, and dark reflections of the human condition, the gold they claim ultimately being cursed. Fafnir's hoard in particular, containing a cursed ring, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that one. In both these Christian and non-Christian narratives, we see traits manifesting in Smaug: a treasure hoard cursed with dragon sickness, bright red gold colouring like the great red dragon, and the guile and cunning of the serpent of Eden, sheer destructive power, an origin in evil, and a hero to oppose them. And while Beowulf's Bane has a relatively straightforward narrative in the poem, Fafnir's role in the legend of Sigurd changes somewhat between different versions of the Norse and Germanic traditions, some of which are listed on the slide here, and whatever technology that has got this live streaming has moved my pictures, my apologies. The foremost of the Germanic versions of this story is the Nibelungenlied, an epic poem based on oral tradition that was composed around the year 1200 in Middle High German. It was then lost around the year 1500 and rediscovered in 1755, after which it gained a prominent place in the German national consciousness. Much of the Nibelungenlied is devoted to the relationship between the four principal characters of Siegfried, Gunther, Brunhilde, and Kriemhild. And in the instance of the dragon and the hoard, is often of secondary importance rather than forming a substantial part of the narrative. In some versions of this story, the dragon Fafnir is not named directly or given an origin story that is deeply tied to the exploits of Norse gods, as it is in the earliest Scandinavian texts. In the early modern period, where the Nibelungenlied was temporarily lost, versions of the story continued, and these contained dragons, sometimes of animalistic form, and the version I'm most interested in, Das Lied von Siegfried, includes a dragon that was actually a man, cursed to take on draconic form, who kidnaps the princess and takes her to his mountain lair of Drakenstein, wherein, somewhat incidentally, also lies the treasure of Nibelung. Das Lied von Siegfried was a popular adventure story rather than a legend, but serves as a good example of popular conceptions of dragons in this period being greedy monsters that are cursed to outwardly look as evil as they inwardly were, an idea we will return to in a bit. Tolkien drew heavily from the version of Fafnir presented in the Norse legends and the Wagnerian opera The Ring of the Nibelung, taking ideas as varied as magic rings, dragon treasure, and birds that understand human speech in his composition of The Hobbit. And while I argue for other influences on Smaug, such as the Great Red Dragon, it is undoubtedly the saga of Sigurd that Tolkien is most conscious in drawing upon. Tolkien's dragon slayers are somewhat of a varied bunch. Eärendil the Mariner cuts a somewhat saintly figure. Meanwhile, Turin fits the mould of a tortured Germanic hero. Bard the Bowman makes for a fairly uncontroversial hero, and of Fram and his vanquishing of Scather there is little written. Though varying in level of complexity of character, Tolkien's heroes all take on a role that fits them neatly into the dichotomies of the traditional medieval dragon-slaying narrative. While they may not be the storm gods of ancient cultures, they follow in St. George and Sigurd's footsteps of halting the evil and chaos of the dragon, ultimately restoring peace to a beleaguered land, and sometimes subtly, and other times less subtly, being guided by the hand of good in the eternal struggle against evil. The early modern dragon, which comprises a lot of my research, however, is often of little concern for Tolkien, caught as it was in the dialogues of the Protestant Reformation. These are what I think of as Smaug's cousin, inheriting some of the Germanic legends of the avaricious Fafnir and much of the DNA of the biblical Satan. The dragon was an effective piece of iconography for religious reformers in the 16th century, having both scriptural and cultural provenance as a familiar symbol to the German people, All of the associated cultural signifiers of the dragon made it an extremely useful rhetorical tool, and as an easily recognized negative symbol, the dragon was hard to misunderstand, enjoying a scriptural precedence for evil that made it particularly alluring as an iconographical motif to Protestants in their struggle against the Catholic Church. This is particularly notable in the evolving Pope dragon of the 16th century, where the papacy could be easily linked to the Antichrist through the medium of the dragon, something that became more overt as the Reformation matured in influence and its theology. This was achieved, as you can see in the top left picture there, by the simple image of placing a papal tiara upon the head of a dragon in images that accompanied the Book of Revelation in early Lutheran Bibles. The symbol of the dragon then became a representation of both papal greed as well as the diabolic, and this motif would then be repeated extensively in the early 16th century. Catholicism was largely unable to develop similarly effective visual culture and was thrown into disarray upon the election of Pope Gregory XIII, whose personal family coat of arms depicted a dragon. These arms were inspired by the animalistic dragon, not the mythological or religious ones, yet could still fall prey to the association with monsters like Fafnir sat atop their piles of gold, or a rampaging apocalyptic Satan. The Pope's illegitimate son, Giacomo Boncampagni, took to the task of wading through natural philosophy, humanistic culture, and the weight of early modern intellectualism to find some way of putting a positive spin on the dragon, enlisting a range of scholars to do so with generally limited success. Most thorough of the emblematists employed was the priest Principio Fabrici, whose 1588 work attempted to address every possible negative connotation of a dragon and argued for a positive one instead, creating a vast array of symbols, which you can see here at the bottom, including ones where a single-headed dragon, like that of the Pope's arms, is held up as a virtuous symbol of God, who fights the multi-headed dragons of Satan. This rebuttal, however, is somewhat obscure and not entirely convincing, though I imagine would have been of some interest to Tolkien as an example of the attempted Catholic rehabilitation of the creature that he found so fascinating. The early modern period, as well as being a time when associations between dragons and the devil were at their height, also represents the last moments of being considered real by the populations of Europe. Dragons had appeared in works of natural history produced by some of the leading minds of the medieval and early modern worlds. Swiss scholar Konrad Gesner, amongst the most famous and most thorough natural historian, to classify dragons in his Historia Animalium. Gesner drew from a variety of classical sources as well as contemporary folklore, his work, therefore, perhaps becoming the most comprehensive contemporary accumulation of non-supernatural dragon knowledge in Europe. Gesner's work was very popular. It was translated out of Latin into the vernacular of several other European languages, where it enjoyed a very wide readership. Represents an impressive synthesis of existing draconic knowledge, drawing upon classical, medieval, and contemporary sources, while also attempting a loose system of categorization. We see here a creature that is presumed to be very real and very dangerous, whose body varies greatly in size and form, but is possessed of great medicinal properties. It is not necessarily evil in these tracts, but it is fearsome and related to several other serpentine beasts that are capable of flight. In the 16th century, coming out of the Middle Ages, the dragon that we see described by Gesner was fact. In the 17th, however, debates were begun to be had. Some scholars had begun to doubt the existence of these creatures due to a lack of reliable modern sightings or specimens. One unusual challenge came from the French biblical scholar Samuel Bocart, who includes dragons in his study of all the animals mentioned in the Bible, where he calls into question some of the dragon's alleged biological capabilities. Bocart dismissed the ability of dragons to fly, for example, citing both the fact that their wings would not be capable of carrying such enormous bodies, and the biblical serpent's curse, where God cursed the serpent of Eden to forever crawl upon their belly in the dust after his deception of Eve is discovered. For Bocart, the dragon, as it was popularly conceived in European culture, could not exist. It was both a biological and scriptural impossibility. Instead, he believes the naturally occurring dragon must be incapable of flight, and that accounts which state otherwise must be inaccurate. Bocart's work was printed in many editions across Europe over the course of the 17th century, and they represent a new kind of threat. Instead of replacing dragons with ideas such as natural phenomenon, claiming that they're actually meteors, for example, he instead began to peel away their more fantastical qualities, reasoning them slowly out of existence. By invoking the serpent's curse, he actually used one of the greatest tools of the dragon's defenders against them, the Bible. This would not stop people from using scriptural authority to defend the dragon, given how often they recur in the Bible, but it made the very idea of the dragon begin to start to seem an impossibility. A century after Gesner, German polymath Athanasius Kircher would also approach the dragon in his work, doing so several times in his expansive and varied corpus, devoting an entire chapter of his work on the underground world to dragons, which he presents as a primarily subterranean cave-dwelling beast, and recounts several anecdotes relating to their behavior from both eyewitness testimony and legend. His tone is defensive, his categories and evidence presented as unassailable. He would be joined by a Swedish bishop, Daniel Norlind, who counters Bocart's arguments that dragons didn't have large enough wings to fly and had been divinely cursed to crawl in the dirt, by claiming instead, quite confidently, that dragons are still cursed to crawl along the dirt, but if they reach a high enough place, they can kind of jump off and glide, which accounts for them flying, which I always find to be a very amusing image. Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, in his Systema Naturae, casts his doubt upon the dragon and places them in his initial work under the category of paradoxa, alongside other fantastical creatures that he didn't really quite know what to do with. His inclusion of dragons in his seminal work, rather than outright dismissing them, is telling of a continued belief in dragons in some parts of the European population, being so entrenched into the cultural imagination that it would have been deemed unusual for him to not mention them at all, even in the early 18th century. Linnaeus, however, would eventually remove the dragon in his 1748 edition of his Systema Naturae, and from then on, dragons were exiled from the pages of natural history and from beliefs surrounding a lived reality. In the long term, however, the 18th century would offer a different kind of death for the dragon. The rediscovery of the Nibelungenlied in 1755 didn't see a re-emergence of belief in real dragons. Instead, these monsters moved from reality into the realm of legend and fairy tale, co-opted by proto-romantics and nationalists as symbol of allegory, although unlike those who came before them, these new users and abusers of the dragon did not believe in the actuality of their subjects. Denis Diderot even remarked that there are already in books all too many fabulous stories of dragons. Believing the dragon to be an over-accounted for in European literature in the 18th century and not accepting their status as a real entity, only as a product of fiction. The dragons of the 18th and 19th century took on a much different role to their predecessors, becoming objects of fantasy rather than monsters people perceived as being real, if somewhat distant animals. And some historians of the dragon have argued that the 18th century was where dragons fell entirely into the realm of imagination, as rationalism removed them from reality. Literary dragons that we see in some 18th century works soon gave way to nursery dragons, a fable for children that was heralded by the dragon-like Jabberwock in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. And once natural historians stopped entertaining dragons as real, they became these fairy tales and even friends and companions rather than apocalyptic demonic aggressors as they had been in prior centuries. Indeed, Kenneth Grahame's short story, The Reluctant Dragon, depicts a creature who lives a gentle bohemian lifestyle, and the children who befriend him even manage to convince St. George that the dragon's not a threat. Edith Nesbit, meanwhile, wrote several children's stories with draconic villains, as well as one titled The Last of the Dragons, in which a princess and a dragon just choose to ignore tradition and become friends instead. The dragon became a shadow of its former self in the European cultural consciousness, and renowned authors like Kirscher would see a drop in their popularity for holding on to ideas and beliefs that scholars flourishing in the 18th century increasingly sought to distance themselves from. Dragons, however, being more of a category of creature than a singular, well-defined entity, are particularly metamorphic. And in the past 100 years, dragons and the dragon-slaying narrative has re-emerged in a multitude of guises, some of which are not too far removed from those earlier examples we've spoken about. Tolkien's Smaug is an archetypal reimagining of the dragons of Northern Europe, which serves as the baseline for these monsters in a modern world, a mighty physical manifestation of greed, fear, and evil that would be all too recognizable to the artists of the Reformation or the storytellers of the medieval period. By contrast, Frank Herbert's Dune and its sequels see dragons reimagined radically for the genre of science fiction in the Sandworms of Arrakis. Much like his deconstruction of messianic figures, the dragon tropes are demythologized by Herbert. Its wealth, the spice melange, being simply a byproduct of its life cycle rather than something actively hoarded, and the protagonists of his works come to ride the sandworms rather than slay them. C.S. Lewis offers a similar approach to Tolkien, though draws upon slightly different mythologies to do so. His dragon in Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the boy Eustace Scrubb, transformed into a dragon through his greed. The draconic curse speaks more to the horrific serpentine transformations of thieves in the seventh Bolgia of Dante's Inferno, or the monstrous change of the greedy king Thorir into a dragon in the Norse saga of the Gold Thorir, his dragon form being a mirror to his nature. Beowulf similarly has the lone survivor character, whom literary scholars have suggested becomes the dragon of the final act after burying the gold of his lost tribe. We can perhaps then paint Lewis's dragon as an estranged brother to Smaug, engaging with some of the same themes and mythologies, but foregrounding the human, metamorphic qualities of some dragons, whilst Smaug represents the power of ultimate evil. The dragons of other contemporary authors we can also perhaps suggest places for on this family tree. The dragons of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones sit somewhere on the far end of the family tree to Smaug, being closer in nature to the animalistic dragons described by Pliny, lacking strong connections to treasure and cosmic evil that Tolkien's dragons do, while also evidently strongly inspired by the dragons of Michael Moorcock's Melniboné that occupy a more animalistic nature. We see then through this rather simplified genealogy that Smaug, in many ways, has avoided or ignored the fate of the early modern dragon, entangled as it was with questions of religion and science, though still remaining somewhat linked to the evil of the biblical dragons as it is the legends of Norse and Germanic mythology. He is no fairy tale dragon, but a powerful reimagining of forces that stretch back to those Proto-Indo-European mythologies. While it may be impossible for us to ever discern a true origin of dragons, I think it is fair to say that Smaug represents one of the greatest distillations of the concept. To end, I'd like to leave you with this final quote from Tolkien on dragons, where he says, "I desired dragons with a profound desire. Of course, I, in my timid body, did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding into my relatively safe world, in which it was, for instance, possible to read stories in peace of mind, free from fear. But the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever cost the peril. As terrifying as dragons might be, and as much as they have changed over the centuries, I think that everyone in this room might agree that Tolkien, that simply the imagination of these creatures makes this a much more interesting world." Thank you all for your time.